The auditorium held maybe 400 people, and every one of them was watching Trent. Lucas was not watching Trent. He was standing in the back, near the exit, partially obscured by a floor-mounted camera rig, and he was looking at a single piece of paper he had removed from his briefcase 40 seconds ago. The paper was not impressive to look at standard weight, USPTO formatting, the kind of bureaucratic document that would bore most people into glazed indifference within 2 sentences. Lucas had read it so many times, he could have recited it from memory. Up at the podium, under lights designed by someone who understood that the announcement of a $100 million acquisition required the visual language of a coronation, Trent was telling the assembled tech press about his journey. His voice had the particular polish of someone who has done enough media training that the performance no longer feels like performance. Warm, self-deprecating in the precisely calibrated way that reads as confident rather than humble, pausing in exactly the right places. "There were nights," Trent said, and the room leaned in slightly, "when I didn't know if we'd make it. Nights when I was alone with the code, trying to figure out if what I was building was even possible." A ripple of appreciative murmuring from the press gallery. Lucas folded the paper carefully and put it back in the briefcase. On the stage, the CEO of the acquiring company, a man named Hargrove whose suits probably cost more than Lucas's car, extended a gold-plated pen across the table. The acquisition document sat between them, thick as a novel. 3 months of legal work by rooms full of very expensive attorneys. Trent reached for the pen. Lucas looked toward the main doors at the back of the room, where 2 of the most accomplished intellectual property litigators on the West Coast were standing in the hallway, waiting for a text message. He was not angry. He noticed that the absence of it. 3 months ago, he might have been. 3 months ago, standing outside the building where he had built something real and been handed a check for $10,000 like a valet tip. He had felt things he wasn't going to describe in detail, because the words for them weren't particularly useful anymore. What he felt now was something closer to the quiet satisfaction of a proof that was about to be demonstrated. He picked up his phone, but to explain the text message, to explain why Lucas Hayes was standing in the back of a press conference with a patent in his briefcase instead of a severance check. You have to go back to a garage in Palo Alto, and a friendship that was real before it became inconvenient. Lucas had met Trent during the first week of freshman year, in the way you meet people when you're 18 and newly away from home, and the social structures haven't calcified yet, by proximity, by accident, by the particular alchemy of 2 people who happen to be in the same place at a moment when both of them need a person to be in a place with. Lucas was the one with the laptop open at midnight in the common room. Trent was the one who sat down across from him and said, without preamble, "What are you building?" Nobody had ever asked Lucas that question with that particular quality of genuine curiosity, and the question mattered more than he could have articulated at the time. They talked until 4 in the morning. Trent understood nothing about the code, but understood immediately why it was interesting, which was a more unusual quality than it sounds. Most people, when Lucas explained what he was working on, responded to the explanation. Trent responded to the work. That was the beginning of 10 years. Lucas understood, looking back now, that he had been in love with the friendship the way you can be in love with a thing that has never given you any particular reason for doubt. He had applied the same trust to Trent that he applied to his own code, the assumption that something well-built would hold. He had not stress-tested it. The algorithm took him the better part of 2 years to develop. He had started it in his junior year as a theoretical exercise, a data compression architecture that operated on principles borrowed from information theory and applied mathematics, the kind of thing that existed in academic papers, but not in production software, because the computational overhead was assumed to be prohibitive. Lucas had found a way around the overhead. He had found 3 ways around it, actually, and the third one was so elegant that he spent a week assuming he'd made an error before he accepted that it actually worked. He had filed the patent application before he told anyone, not because he was suspicious, specifically, more because Lucas was the kind of person who read the terms of service on things other people clicked through, who backed up his work before he was done with it, who considered downside scenarios not out of pessimism, but out of the same analytical reflex that made him good at the work in the first place. The patent was filed under a blind LLC he had set up with the help of a law student friend and $40 in state filing fees. The LLC owned the patent. Lucas owned the LLC. The patent was for the core algorithmic architecture, the thing that made everything else possible. Then he told Trent. Trent's response was immediate and luminous, the specific brightness of a person who has just recognized an opportunity. Within a week, he had drafted a pitch deck. Within a month, he had meetings with 2 VC firms. Within 6 months, they had seed funding and a company. Lucas negotiated one provision into the operating agreement, buried in the intellectual property section on page 41, that Trent's lawyers had reviewed and not flagged because it appeared, to a standard reading, to simply confirm what was already obvious, that the company had the right to use the algorithm. What it actually confirmed was that the company had a revocable license to use the algorithm, revocable by Lucas, as the licensor, upon 30 days notice under standard conditions, or 24 hours notice in the event of the licensor's termination without cause. Trent had not read page 41. Lucas had known Trent had not read page 41. He had not mentioned it. For 3 years, Lucas built. That is the simplest way to say it, and also the most accurate. While Trent traveled San Francisco to New York to London to Singapore, pitching to investors in glass conference rooms at altitudes that required noise-canceling headphones, Lucas sat in the office they had rented, which was a converted storage unit with inadequate ventilation and excellent fiber internet, and he wrote code. He wrote code for 14 hours a day, sometimes more. He ate at his desk. He slept on a cot in the back corner during the periods when sleeping elsewhere felt like too much time away from the problem. He hired 2 junior engineers in the second year, both of whom were talented, and he worked them hard and paid them fairly, and they produced good work. But the core architecture, the thing that made the product what it was his. The way certain things are yours not because of paperwork, but because they came from somewhere in you that nothing else comes from. The product worked. That was the thing. It genuinely, demonstrably worked in ways that the industry had considered difficult to demonstrate, and the metrics reflected it. And the metrics were what brought the VCs back with larger checks, and the larger checks were what brought the acquisition rumors. Lucas became aware of the rumors at approximately the same time he became aware that Trent had stopped answering his calls promptly. Not completely. Trent was too skilled a social operator for that, but the response time stretched, and the responses when they came were shorter, and there was a quality to them that Lucas, who was not particularly fluent in social subtlety, but had known this specific person for 10 years, recognized as the quality of someone managing a relationship rather than existing in one. He noted it, he didn't raise it. 3 weeks later, Trent called an emergency board meeting. The boardroom was on the 14th floor of a building in Soma, one of the spaces the VCs used for portfolio company meetings. Glass walls on 2 sides, a view of the bay if you looked past the whiteboard. Lucas arrived 3 minutes early and found the room already occupied. 4 people from the VC firm, Trent's new general counsel, and Trent, who was standing at the head of the table in a suit Lucas didn't recognize and had probably purchased recently. Trent shook Lucas's hand. The handshake was firm and warm in the practiced way, and lasted exactly as long as a handshake should last, and communicated nothing that a handshake usually communicated between people who had eaten 3,000 meals together. Lucas sat down. The general counsel spoke for 11 minutes. He used the phrase recapitalization event 4 times and dilutive issuance 3 times, and per the terms of the Series B agreement, so often it began to function as punctuation. What he was describing, translated out of the deliberate grammatical fog of corporate law, was this. A provision buried in the Series B funding documents allowed the investors to issue new shares under specific conditions, and those conditions had now been met, and the new shares were being issued, and the effect of the issuance was to reduce Lucas's 50% ownership to approximately 1%. The math took 5 minutes. Nobody at the table looked at Lucas while the math was happening. Trent looked at the whiteboard. The general counsel looked at his documents. The VCs looked at their phones, or at the bay, or at their own hands, with the studied attention of people who have been in rooms like this before, and have learned that looking at the person being reduced is impolite in a way that might be remembered. When the math was finished, Trent placed a check on the table and slid it across to Lucas with the smooth, unhurried movement of someone returning a borrowed book. The check was for $10,000. It had been filled out beforehand, which meant the amount had been decided before Lucas arrived, which meant the meeting was not a negotiation. "It's just business, Lucas." Trent's voice was warm. His PR-trained smile was present and symmetric. "You're an incredible engineer, truly, but the buyers, they want a clean cap table. They want a visionary at the helm. You're a builder, and that's a gift. But this next chapter needs something different." Lucas looked at the check. "You built something real," Trent said, and the sentence was designed to sound like a compliment, and Lucas could see the design of it, the way you can see the frame of a building through transparent cladding. "I want you to know I see that." The general counsel placed a document in front of Lucas. Termination of employment, effective immediately, severance terms as outlined in the accompanying check. Lucas picked up the pen. He signed. Later, he would be asked why he had signed without a fight, without a scene, without the explosion of rage that the situation seemed to demand. The answer was that he had known, on some level, that the explosion was exactly what Trent and the lawyers had prepared for. They had structured this to produce either compliance or a prolonged legal battle over wrongful termination, which pays out in thousands and takes years. He had no interest in either outcome. He had a different outcome in mind. Security met him in the lobby. Two men in matching blazers, apologetic and professional, who helped him carry the box of his personal items from his office and walked him to the front door without making eye contact. He stood on the sidewalk. The afternoon was clear, the kind of San Francisco clear that happens in October when the marine layer has burned off, and the light has a quality that makes the city look like a place from an old photograph of itself. Cars went by. Someone on a delivery bike threaded between them. The building behind him contained everything he had built for 3 years. He held the box under one arm and the check in his other hand, and stood there for approximately 90 seconds. Then he walked to his car. He drove home to his apartment. Not the converted storage unit, not anywhere associated with the company, just his apartment. And he went to his bedroom closet, and he moved the winter coats to one side, and he crouched down, and he turned the dial on the small fireproof safe on the floor. The safe contained 3 things: his passport, a hard drive, and a manila folder. He took out the folder. He sat on the edge of his bed and opened it, and looked at the document inside, which he had not looked at in approximately 3 years, which had been sitting in this safe since before the company had a name or a bank account, or a single line of production code. The USPTO filing number was at the top. His blind LLC's name was listed as the registrant. The date of filing was 8 months before the operating agreement was signed. Lucas sat with it for a moment. Then he said, quietly, to no one in particular, "You should have learned to read code, Trent." He put the folder on the desk, opened his laptop, and began searching for intellectual property litigation firms. Lucas deposited the $10,000 check on a Monday morning. The teller at the bank was a young woman who counted the bills with the automatic efficiency of someone who processes other people's money all day, without particularly thinking about what it represents. Lucas watched the transaction complete on the screen in front of him and thought about the fact that this check, a Trent's dismissal of 3 years and a decade of friendship, his assessment of what Lucas's contribution to a $100 million asset was worth, was about to become the retainer for the most expensive intellectual property litigation firm in the state of California. There was something satisfying about the arithmetic of that, even before anything else had happened. He walked out of the bank. He had an appointment at 2 o'clock, but first, he needed to explain something to himself, in the way that people who work alone sometimes narrate their own thinking, and to anyone who would eventually need to understand what he had built and why it worked. 3 years before Trent called the board meeting, before there was a company or a cap table or a general counsel who used the phrase dilutive issuance. With a straight face, Lucas had been sitting alone in his apartment with a working prototype of something that didn't exist yet in the world. He had been 24 years old. He had read enough about the technology industry, enough founder memoirs, enough postmortems, enough cautionary filings from startup litigation databases that he accessed for reasons most people his age did not have, to understand that the history of innovation was littered with the names of people who had built real things, and ended up owning none of them. He was not going to be one of those people. The patent filing had taken 3 months, and the help of a law student he knew from college who had since graduated and now practiced IP law in Oakland. The filing covered the core algorithmic architecture, not the applications, not the interface, not the product decisions that would come later, but the fundamental mathematical structure that made the compression work, the thing that would be worthless to copy without and irreplaceable with. He had filed it under a limited liability company called Hayes Data Architecture LLC, registered in Delaware, with a registered agent and a PO box, and no public connection to Lucas Hayes personally. The blind LLC structure was not complicated. It was not exotic. It was the kind of legal hygiene that sophisticated IP holders used routinely, and that most 24-year-old software engineers did not think about because they were thinking about the code. Lucas thought about the code and the legal hygiene simultaneously. It was not a special talent. It was just the same habit of mind that made him patch security vulnerabilities before they were exploited. The recognition that systems have failure points, that the time to address failure points is before they fail. When he and Trent incorporated the startup 6 months later, Lucas had drafted the intellectual property section of the operating agreement himself. Trent's lawyers had reviewed it. They had found nothing concerning, because the section was written to look like standard IP assignment language, confirmation that the company had the rights to use the core technology, which was accurate. What it did not say, because it was not required to say, was that the company owned the technology. It said the company had a license, a revocable license. The revocation clause was on page 41, subsection 7(c), in language that was technically precise and deliberately dull. Lucas had written it to be skippable by anyone who wasn't specifically looking for it. Most IP licensing agreements had revocation clauses of some kind. It was normal boilerplate, the kind of thing that lawyers skim and initial without comment. The specific trigger was what mattered. Standard revocation. 30 days written notice, either party with or without cause. Amended trigger, subsection 7(c), Roman 2. In the event of the licensor's involuntary termination from any affiliated entity without documented cause, revocation notice period reduced to 24 hours. Trent had fired Lucas without cause. There was no performance record, no documented complaint, no process. The general counsel had produced a termination agreement but not a cause, because there wasn't one. Lucas had not done anything wrong. He had simply become inconvenient, which meant the clock on the revocation was 24 hours, not 30 days, which meant timing was everything. Trent's media tour began the week after the termination. Lucas watched it from his apartment, which was quiet and somewhat cluttered, and had the particular quality of a space that belongs to a person who is alone by choice rather than by accident. He had 3 monitors on his desk, and he kept one of them running a news aggregator that he had trained over several months to surface anything published about the acquisition. There was a considerable amount to surface. Trent was a gifted interview subject. He understood intuitively what journalists wanted: the narrative of the lone genius, the sleepless nights, the bet everything moment, and he delivered it with the consistency of someone who has practiced a story until it has the feel of memory. In a profile for a technology publication, he described the algorithm's development as a 3-year process of iteration that pushed me to the edge of what I thought was technically possible. In a podcast appearance, he said he had written the original architecture on a napkin during a flight to Tokyo, before bringing on engineers to execute the vision. In a panel discussion, he spoke about the importance of protecting your IP from day one, and the audience laughed appreciatively. Lucas watched the panel clip twice. He was not angry. He had cataloged that absence already, and it continued to hold. What he felt instead, watching Trent perform a version of Lucas's work for audiences that had no way of knowing the difference, was something more clinical. He was observing a system operating exactly as he had predicted it would operate. The prediction being accurate was not a comfort exactly, but it was a kind of confirmation. He kept a document on his desktop where he logged the quotes. Not for emotional reasons, for legal ones. Trent's public statements about the algorithm's provenance would be relevant when the revocation was contested, as it would be. He saved each article as a PDF, labeled with the date and source, filed into a folder on an encrypted drive. The yacht appeared on a Tuesday afternoon. Lucas was in the middle of a problem. He still wrote code, still worked on the architecture even without a company around it, because the work was the work regardless of the corporate context. When his phone buzzed with a text from a number he had not yet deleted. The message was a photograph, a white yacht, large enough to have a name painted on the stern, moored in what appeared to be a slip in the San Francisco Bay. The afternoon light on the water, Trent standing on the deck in sunglasses, one hand on the railing, the posture of a man who has arrived somewhere. Below the photo, "Sorry it had to be this way, buddy. Enjoy the 10K. And then, after a pause of approximately 40 seconds, a second message, a winking emoji. Lucas looked at the photo for a moment. He noted the name on the yacht's stern. He noted the marina in the background, recognizable, specific. He added this information to the document on his desktop, including the timestamp of the text message. Then he went back to the problem he had been working on. The thing about Trent, the thing that Lucas had understood for years without fully examining, was that his confidence had always been generative. It was the quality that made him effective at pitching, at closing, at convincing rooms full of skeptical people to give him large sums of money. Trent believed in himself with a completeness that was almost physical, and other people felt that belief and responded to it. The problem was that the confidence had always been contingent. It worked because the outcomes had cooperated. Trent had never been in a situation where the confidence didn't ultimately resolve into something that confirmed it. And so the confidence had grown, steadily, from a useful tool into a comprehensive worldview. The unexamined assumption that the story he was telling was the real story, that what he believed about himself was what was true. He had fired Lucas and sent him a yacht photo because he was confident. He was confident because he had won. He believed he had won because he had never seriously entertained the possibility that Lucas had, 3 years ago, quietly installed a floor beneath the floor. The acquisition was announced on a Wednesday, not the closing, the announcement of the intent to acquire, with a deal value of $100 million, and a signing ceremony scheduled for that Friday at noon at the Hotel Marcellus in the Soma district. The press release described the target company as a pioneer in next-generation data compression technology, with proprietary algorithmic architecture at the core of its value proposition. Lucas read the press release once and closed the tab. He opened his calendar and blocked Friday from 11 a.m. to 3 p.m. He called the IP firm. He had been in contact with them for several weeks by this point. A preliminary consultation during which he had explained the structure and the filing and the license agreement, and during which the senior partner, a woman named Kathleen Reyes, whose reputation in IP litigation was specific enough that Lucas had found her name in 3 separate case studies before he called, had listened to him with the focused attention of someone who is identifying the contours of something significant. She had called him back 2 days later. The call had lasted 40 minutes. At the end of it, she had said, "I want to be direct with you. What you're describing is either the most thoroughly prepared piece of legal self-preservation I've encountered in 20 years of practice, or there's a problem with the filing I haven't found yet. I've looked at the filing. There isn't a problem." Lucas had thanked her. "One question," she had said before ending the call. "Why didn't you do this sooner?" "I needed to wait for the right moment," Lucas said. "Which is when the valuation peaks. If I revoke the license before the acquisition, the company's value drops immediately, and the legal battle is over a reduced number. If I revoke at the moment of signing, in front of the acquiring company's CEO, the company's value drops to 0 in real time, and the acquiring company has a direct incentive to deal with me instead." There was a pause on Kathleen's end. "Friday at noon," Lucas said. She had understood immediately. Thursday arrived the way days arrive when something is about to happen, with an ordinary morning that feels slightly unreal. The light coming through the windows at the same angle it always did, the coffee tasting the same, the world entirely indifferent to the fact that a structure is about to change. Lucas spent the morning reviewing documents. Not nervously, he was not a nervous person, or if he was, his nervousness expressed itself as increased focus rather than increased activity, a narrowing of attention rather than a scattering of it. He had the patent. He had the licensing agreement. He had the revocation notice, drafted by Kathleen's office, dated for Thursday afternoon to satisfy the 24-hour window. He had the direct offer to the acquiring company, drafted on Hayes Data Architecture LLC letterhead, addressed to the CEO by name, proposing an alternative transaction at the same value with clean title. He had everything. He printed the set of documents and put them in a manila folder. He picked up the folder and his keys. He drove across the city. The law firm occupied the top 3 floors of a building on Market Street. The kind of office where the furniture is chosen to communicate that the people who work here are not worried about the cost of furniture, and where the view from the conference room on a clear day includes most of the bay. Lucas had been here twice before for consultations. He knew the layout. He arrived at 11:59. Kathleen was waiting in the lobby. She was in her late 40s, compact and precise, with the kind of stillness that belongs to people who have spent a career in rooms where the stakes were high and the composure necessary. She had 2 associates with her, the process servers who would handle the physical delivery, and a paralegal carrying a second set of documents. Lucas placed the folder on the reception desk. Kathleen looked at him. Ready. He thought about Trent at the podium tomorrow, under the lights, the gold-plated pen, the cameras. He thought about the yacht. He thought about a text that said, "Enjoy the 10K," and a winking emoji sent to a person who had given 10 years of genuine friendship and 3 years of genuine work, and received a box of personal items and a security escort to the curb. "I want to revoke a license," Lucas said. Kathleen nodded once. The associates moved. The clock read 12:01, 23 hours and 59 minutes. The Hotel Marcellus had been chosen deliberately. Lucas understood that about Trent, that every decision he made about optics was deliberate, calculated for the impression it would leave on whoever was watching. The Marcellus was the kind of hotel that existed to host moments that needed to feel historic. Grand ballroom, 14-foot ceilings, chandeliers that had been photographed in the backgrounds of enough technology announcements to have become a kind of Silicon Valley shorthand for arrival. When you held your press conference at the Marcellus, you were saying something about the scale of what you believed you had achieved. Trent had booked the main ballroom. Lucas stood outside the hotel at 8:30 in the morning, an hour before the press would be admitted, 2 hours before the signing. He was in a dark jacket and dark pants, not the kind of outfit anyone would describe later as notable, which was the intention. He looked up at the building's facade for a moment, then looked at his phone. Kathleen had texted at 8:17, process servers confirmed, positions set, waiting on your signal. He typed back, noon, not before. He went inside to find coffee. The ballroom transformed itself between 8 and 10 with the organized efficiency of an industry that had learned to stage corporate theater at scale. Camera crews from 3 networks. A photographer pool corralled behind a rope line to the left of the stage. Print journalists at round tables with branded notepads. The stage itself was elevated, draped in the acquiring company's colors, with 2 chairs and a table between them bearing the acquisition documents. And Lucas noted this. The gold-plated pen, already positioned, oriented toward the chair where Trent would sit. Someone had planned the pen placement. That was Trent. Only Trent would think about the pen placement. Lucas took a position near the back, close to the camera rig that would give him partial cover from the stage sightlines. He had done this before the first time, in the auditorium with the patent in his briefcase, which was also this time, which was the loop the story was running inside. He had stood here twice now, at the beginning and the end of the same morning. He ordered a coffee from the bar setup along the back wall and drank it standing up. At 10:15, Trent arrived. He came in through the side entrance with the practiced timing of a person who understands that entering too early dilutes the effect, and entering too late creates a different impression than intended. He was in a suit that Lucas did not recognize, and which fit him with the specific perfection of something recently made rather than something recently bought. His hair was arranged with the kind of deliberate naturalness that takes longer to achieve than actual naturalness. He was already talking before he fully entered the room, a word to the event coordinator, a laugh with the PR person who materialized at his side, a handshake with someone from the acquiring company's communications team who had been waiting near the door. He moved through the ballroom like someone who had already won, and was now conducting a leisurely review of the territory. Lucas watched him from the back. He thought about the common room in the freshman dorm, the open laptop. "What are you building?" said with that particular quality of genuine curiosity that Lucas had never forgotten, because it had been the first time someone had asked that question and meant it. He thought about the converted storage unit and the cot in the back corner, and the months where the ventilation was bad enough in summer that they'd had to buy industrial fans, and the noise of the fans was the background sound of 2 years of work. He thought about 10 years. He finished his coffee. He did not feel what he might have expected to feel, looking at Trent across the length of the ballroom. The complicated weight of a decade of friendship ending was still present. It had not gone away, and he did not think it would, and he had stopped expecting it to. But it was not the thing running in the foreground anymore. What was running in the foreground was considerably simpler. He looked at his watch. 1 hour and 41 minutes. The CEO of the acquiring company, Marcus Hargrove, 61 years old, 3 prior acquisitions of comparable scale, reputation for methodical due diligence and extraordinary impatience with surprises, arrived at 10:40 with a security detail and 2 members of his legal team. He shook Trent's hand with the warm efficiency of a man who had shaken many hands in rooms like this, and had learned to be present for each one without being altered by any of them. They moved to the green room behind the stage. The press filled in steadily from 11 onward. Lucas watched the room achieve its design density, enough people to feel significant, curated tightly enough that every person present had been chosen for the impression their presence would create. Tech journalists whose coverage shaped the industry's narrative, photographers whose images would circulate for days, a pair of television cameras whose feeds would go live the moment the signing began. At 11:15, his phone buzzed. "Kathleen, we're in position. 2 process servers in the lobby, 1 at each ballroom entrance. I'm outside the green room corridor." Lucas, copy. "Hold until I signal." Kathleen, understood. "1 question, are you in the room?" Lucas, back row, camera side. A pause, then good seat. He put his phone in his pocket. The program began at 11:45 with remarks from the event moderator, a journalist whose presence lent the proceedings a quality of editorial legitimacy, and moved through brief introductory comments from the acquiring company's communications director before arriving at what everyone had come for. Trent walked onto the stage to the kind of applause that an audience produces when it has been primed to feel it is witnessing something important. He moved to the podium with the unhurried confidence of a person who has been in rooms like this in his imagination many times and finds the reality smaller than expected, which makes it easier. He thanked the moderator. He thanked the acquiring company. He thanked his team, a collective noun that gestured toward a group without specifying individuals, which was a technique Lucas had noticed him developing over the past several months. He did not say any names. Then he began to talk about the work. 3 years ago, Trent said, his voice settling into the cadence Lucas recognized from the podcast, from the panel, from every version of this story Trent had been refining across a media tour built on the assumption that no one in the room knew the actual sequence of events. I sat down with a problem that the industry had been calling unsolvable. The room was very quiet. The cameras were running. The compression problem isn't a hardware problem. Everyone was treating it as a hardware problem, throw more compute at it, optimize the pipeline, iterate on the infrastructure. I looked at it differently. I looked at it as a mathematical problem, and I started working through the architecture from first principles. Lucas stood very still at the back of the room. There were nights when I didn't know if what I was building was possible. The pause landed exactly where it was designed to land. Nights when the only thing keeping me going was the knowledge that if the math was right, if I had actually found what I thought I'd found, it would change how data moved through every system on the planet. A murmur through the press gallery, the kind that journalists produce when they are already constructing sentences. And it does. Applause. Lucas looked at his watch. 11:51. He reached into his jacket pocket and felt the phone, did not take it out yet. Kathleen was in position. The process servers were in position. The documents, the revocation notice, the cease and desist, the direct offer in the blue folder, the cease and desist in the red folder, had been prepared and reviewed and proofread and reviewed again. Everything was where it needed to be. On the stage, Trent moved from the podium to the table. Hargrove emerged from the wings and joined him, the two of them taking their chairs with the synchronized timing of people who had rehearsed the choreography of this moment. Someone handed Hargrove a water glass. Someone adjusted a camera angle. The acquisition documents were already arranged between the chairs. The moderator said something ceremonial. Lucas didn't track the words. Trent picked up the gold-plated pen. Lucas took out his phone. He typed one word to Kathleen. Now. He pressed send. For 4 seconds, nothing visible changed. The room continued its focused attention on the stage. The cameras continued running. Trent held the pen above the first signature line and said something to Hargrove that made Hargrove smile in the brief, polished way of a man who smiles on cue. Then the ballroom doors at the back opened. Kathleen came through first, dark blazer, flat expression. A woman moving with the unhurried purposefulness that belongs to people who have legal authority in a room and do not need to perform it. Behind her, the 2 process servers, each carrying a folder. One red, one blue. The murmur started near the back and moved forward through the room like a slow wave, the particular sound of an audience registering something it does not yet understand. A few cameras turned toward the aisle. A journalist half rose from her chair. Kathleen walked the full length of the center aisle without slowing. The stage was elevated, but not by much, a single step up, accessible from the front. She took it without hesitation. The event moderator said something toward her microphone that came out as an incomplete sentence. A security person near the stage started to move and then stopped, recognizing the nature of what was happening. The suits, the documents, the process servers, and making the correct calculation that this was not a physical situation. Trent looked up from the signature line. His face moved through something, the confusion first, genuine and unguarded, the expression of a person who encounters something that doesn't fit the current model. Then a recalibration, the PR composure reasserting itself. "I'm sorry," he said toward Kathleen, with the practiced warmth of a man who is not sorry. "We're in the middle of Trent Calloway." Kathleen's voice was even and clear, and carried to the room without any particular effort, which was worse than if she had raised it. "I represent Hayes Data Architecture, LLC, the registered holder of U.S. patent number 11,840,7293, covering the core algorithmic architecture, currently licensed to your company under agreement dated March 3rd, 3 years prior." The room had gone very still. Pursuant to Section 7(c) Roman 2 of the Revocable Software Licensing Agreement, and in light of the involuntary termination of the licensor on September 14th without documented cause, this document constitutes formal notice of license revocation, effective as of 11:59 a.m. today. She placed the red folder on the table in front of Trent. She handed the blue folder directly to Marcus Hargrove. Hargrove looked at the folder in his hands, then at Kathleen, then slowly at the folder again. He opened it. The room held. Hargrove was a careful reader. Lucas had researched him thoroughly enough to know this, to know that unlike many executives of his stature, he read documents himself rather than summarizing them through staff. He took 40 seconds with the blue folder. The cameras tracked him. The journalists, who had been uncertain what was happening, were now certain something was happening, and the quiet in the ballroom had the quality of an intake of breath that had not yet been released. Hargrove set the folder down. He looked at Trent with the expression of a man who has arrived at a conclusion he does not particularly enjoy, and has decided that the most efficient path forward is directness. "You don't own the algorithm," he said. Not a question. Trent's PR composure was still technically in place, the face still composed, the shoulders still square, but something behind it had shifted, and the shift was visible to anyone watching closely, which everyone in the room now was. "That's," he glanced at his general counsel, who had materialized at the edge of the stage with the slightly gray quality of a man who has just understood something about his professional situation. "That's a disgruntled former employee making a last minute." Hargrove held up the patent registration. The paper caught the chandelier light. "This is a USPTO filing dated 3 years ago," he said. His voice had not changed, still the measured cadence of a man who has delivered difficult assessments in important rooms before, registered to an entity that is not your company. "This document in my hand says the license to use this patent was revoked 1 hour ago." He set the paper down. "You're asking me to pay $100 million for a company whose core asset it does not own." The sentence landed in the room the way certain sentences do, not loudly, but with a weight that spread outward from the point of impact and kept moving. Trent said something. Lucas didn't catch it from the back of the room, but he saw Trent's mouth moving and saw the general counsel step forward, and saw Hargrove make the small, precise gesture of a man who has decided a conversation is over and is declining further entries. Hargrove closed the blue folder. He set the gold-plated pen on the table, and from the back of the room, Lucas finally moved. The room watched Lucas walk. He was aware of this, the cameras tracking, the journalists recalibrating, the particular quality of attention that fills a space when an unexpected figure moves through it with evident purpose. He did not alter his pace. He walked from the back of the ballroom to the front with the same unhurried certainty that Kathleen had walked the center aisle 60 seconds earlier. And the crowd made room for him without being asked. The way crowds make room for things they don't yet understand but can feel the weight of. He reached the stage. Trent saw him at approximately the same moment Lucas put his foot on the step. What happened to Trent's face in that moment was not something Lucas had anticipated exactly, but was also not something he was surprised by. The PR composure, the practiced architecture of the media tour, the product launch, the boardroom, held for perhaps 2 seconds after recognition landed. Then it didn't. Not catastrophically, not in the way of a person who loses control entirely. More like a building that has had its structural support removed and has not yet fallen, but is no longer standing in the way it was designed to. Trent said his name, just Lucas, nothing attached to it. No accusation, no demand, no performance of the confidence that had been present in every version of his voice for the past 3 months. Just the name, in the voice of someone who has arrived at a door they did not know was in front of them. Lucas stepped onto the stage. He was aware of Hargrove to his left, standing with the particular stillness of a man who has assessed a situation and decided that observation is currently more valuable than action. He was aware of the cameras. He was aware of Trent's general counsel 2 steps back, a man who was almost certainly doing rapid calculations about professional liability and finding the results unwelcome. He looked at Trent. 10 years, the common room, the storage unit, the cot, the industrial fans running through the August nights, every line of code in the product that was now described in a USPTO filing under a Delaware LLC's name, the check for $10,000 and the winking emoji, and the yacht named with something Lucas hadn't bothered to remember. He had prepared things to say. He had thought about this moment in the specific way that people who are alone with a problem think about its resolution, running versions of it, discarding the ones that felt performative, keeping the ones that felt true. He had arrived at something simple. You should have read the operating agreement, Lucas said. Trent opened his mouth. Page 41, Lucas said. Subsection 7C, I wrote it myself. The room was recording this. He was aware of that and was not troubled by it. The words were accurate and they were his, and they did not require any adjustment for the audience. Trent said, and Lucas watched the PR training attempt to reassert itself one final time. The jaw setting, the shoulders squaring, the voice reaching for the register that had always worked in rooms like this. Lucas, whatever you think you're doing, this isn't. It's just business, Trent. The sentence landed. Lucas saw it land, saw Trent recognize the words. His own words, spoken in the same boardroom tone, returned now with the precision of something that had been held at the right temperature for exactly the right amount of time. He let the silence hold for a moment. Then he turned. Hargrove was already moving toward him. Not with urgency. Hargrove was not a man who expressed urgency through his body, which was part of what had made him effective across 4 decades of acquisitions. He moved with the deliberate ease of someone who has decided what the next step is and is taking it. He stopped 2 feet from Lucas and extended his hand. Lucas shook it. I've read the filing, Hargrove said, his voice low enough that it didn't carry to the press gallery. My legal team verified it while you were walking up here. That was fast. I had them on standby when the folders came in. A brief pause. I'm going to ask you a direct question. Okay. Is there any legal encumbrance on the patent itself? Any competing claim? Any prior license that survived the revocation? Anything that would complicate a clean transfer? No, the LLC holds it free and clear. The revocation was the only outstanding license. Hargrove studied him for a moment, not with suspicion, exactly, but with the evaluative attention of a man who prices things for a living and is currently pricing what is in front of him. Same number, Hargrove said. 100 million, paid to the LLC. Clean title, full assignment. We execute the paperwork in the lobby in 30 minutes. Lucas thought about the number for approximately 2 seconds, not because he was uncertain about it, but because he wanted to be sure the answer he gave was the one he actually meant rather than the one produced by the momentum of the moment. "Yes," he said. Hargrove turned to his legal team, who had materialized at his shoulder with the efficiency of people who are paid to be ready for exactly these situations, and said 4 words. "Draft the assignment agreement." They moved. What happened to Trent in the next 30 minutes, Lucas observed from a distance rather than proximity, and deliberately so. He had said what he intended to say. The rest was not his to conduct. Trent attempted, in the immediate aftermath, to address the room some version of an explanation, a reframing, the instinct of a person who has built a career on narrative control, reaching for that control in the moment it was least available to him. The cameras were still running. The journalists were still recording. Whatever he said became, within hours, the footage that every technology publication led with, not the signing that had been planned, but the unsigning, the before and after of a $100 million deal evaporating in real time. The VC partners left the ballroom without speaking to him. Lucas had anticipated this. The venture capital relationship with a founder is transactional in a direction that runs precisely as long as the founder is generating returns. And Trent had just converted their $100 million exit into a legal liability. The math on their loyalty was simple, and it resolved instantly. The lawsuits arrived within a week. The VCs sued for gross negligence and fraudulent representation, the claim being that Trent had represented the company as owning the IP outright and had done so knowing, or being recklessly indifferent to whether the representation was accurate. The legal standard for gross negligence in a securities context was not a high bar, and Trent's own statements, the podcast, the profile, the panel discussion about protecting your IP from day one, had created a paper trail that his lawyers would spend considerable time and money attempting to contextualize. The yacht was listed on a marine asset auction site 6 weeks later. Lucas did not look up what it sold for. It wasn't information he needed. The lobby of the Hotel Marcellus was quieter than the ballroom. By the time Lucas sat down at a round table with Hargrove's legal team and Kathleen, the agreement was not complicated. A patent assignment, clean and direct. Hayes Data Architecture LLC conveying full title to the acquiring company for $100 million. The kind of transaction that takes 4 pages when there are no complications, and was 4 pages in this case. Lucas read it himself. He read everything himself. It took him 11 minutes, which Kathleen timed, and which Hargrove's team waited for without visible impatience, which told him something useful about the kind of people they were to work with. He signed on the designated line. His signature was unremarkable. He had never practiced it or thought about it. It was just the way his hand produced his name when asked to, slightly cramped, the H oversized relative to the rest. The same signature he had used on every document for 27 years. Kathleen countersigned as the LLC's registered agent. Hargrove signed across the table. Someone from the legal team collected the pages and arranged them into a folder with the systematic efficiency of a process being completed. Someone else produced a document confirming the wire transfer initiation, which would resolve within 2 business days. Lucas looked at the confirmation document, $100 million, payable to Hayes Data Architecture LLC. His blind LLC, formed on a law student's advice 4 years ago for $40 in filing fees, which had held a patent that had held a company that had been intended to hold nothing for him at all. He folded the confirmation and put it in his jacket pocket. He stood up, shook Hargrove's hand again, thanked Kathleen, who accepted the thanks with the professional briskness of someone who would celebrate later in private and preferred it that way. He picked up his briefcase. He walked out of the Hotel Marcellus into the afternoon. The October light was doing the same thing it had done 3 months ago. On the sidewalk outside the building, where he had built everything and been escorted out carrying a cardboard box. That quality of San Francisco afternoon that makes the city look like a photograph of itself. Clear and slightly gold. The kind of light that doesn't offer comfort but doesn't withhold it either. That simply exists, indifferently luminous, the same for everyone standing in it. Lucas stood on the sidewalk for a moment. He had built a $100 million algorithm, and his best friend had handed him a $10,000 check to walk away. He had walked away with everything. He thought about Trent for the last time he intended to think about him. A deliberate last time, the closing of a file, not with hatred, which would have required an ongoing emotional investment he had no use for, and not with the complicated grief of the friendship he had carried for 3 months, which had not gone away but had arrived, finally, at a place where it could be set down. He thought about what Trent had been, genuinely, before greed had simplified him into something smaller. The enthusiasm in the common room. The pitch decks built on actual excitement rather than calculated positioning. The years when the friendship had been real, before the money made it conditional. He thought about those years, for the length of time it takes to walk to a car. Then he got in, and pulled out of the parking structure and drove. He had already identified the building he wanted for the new firm. An office in the Mission District, former warehouse space, the kind of high ceilings and raw concrete that appealed to the engineers he intended to fund. The people who were actually building things and needed someone in the room who understood what building things cost and what it was worth, and how to make sure the person who did the building was the person who held the patent. He had a meeting there next Tuesday. The wire transfer would resolve by then. He merged onto the freeway and let the city fall behind him. And for the first time in 3 months, since the boardroom, since the cardboard box, since the $10,000 check, and the winking emoji and everything that had followed, he felt the specific interior quiet of a person who has finished what they set out to finish and can now simply drive. That was enough, more than enough.